Awesome. Welcome to the Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. I am Shalise Worthy. I'm the Historical Services Coordinator here at the Central Library, and we are delighted to welcome Dr. Camden Burd to the library this evening. And we are grateful to have been able to partner with our colleagues at the University of Rochester for this event. I have just a couple of pieces of housekeeping to go over with you. To find the restrooms, you will exit the main entrance and take an immediate left. And at 6:50 p.m. and at 7 p.m., there will be an automatic announcement that the library is closing. You can disregard that announcement, as this program will continue running after regular hours. At this time, I'd like to hand the mic to Maurini Strub, Interim Dean of the University of Rochester Libraries.
Thank you, Shalise. Thank you, everybody, for turning out tonight and joining us this evening. We are truly excited about this partnership with Rochester Public Libraries, and we're thrilled to come together to welcome our U of R alumnus, Camden Burd. As you know, he's here to share his book, The Roots of Flower City, and we couldn't be more eager to hear from him. Before we welcome Camden to the stage, I want to share the recent loss of Trustee Emeritus Andy Neely. Andy was a distinguished alumnus and devoted champion of the university and its libraries. And he and his wife, Janet, endowed the library deanship and helped us to create the Neely Author Series. Andy often said, "The library is the key to the university. It is the center for everything else that happens here." And Andy embodied that belief through his enduring leadership and philanthropy, and we at the libraries could not be more grateful for his support. Andy was 101 years old when he passed, So tonight's lecture is presented by the River Campus Library's Neely Author Series and the Dr. Matthew E. and Ruth Harmon Fairbank Alumni Lecture and the Rochester Public Library's Local History and Genealogy Division. It's now my pleasure to welcome Camden and introduce him as tonight's featured speaker. Camden.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out here. This is a great turnout. I didn't know what to expect. But of course, I know Rochester shows up, and so I'm so excited to be here. First, I want to thank the Central Library, the Public Library of Rochester, Monroe County, for helping support this. I also want to support the University of Rochester, a place that has meant a lot to me over the years. Of course, there are several members in this room who were foundational through every step of writing and researching and making it through this process. So I want to make sure that they get special recognition as well. And of course, I want to thank you all for coming out here on what is a beautiful spring day in Rochester, New York. And you're inside. At least we'll be talking about nature, so you can feel close to it, right? You can feel the sort of vernal splendor of the tonight's topic as well. It is Earth Day, so I feel like this is quite a nice sort of synergy here. The first Earth Day was in 1970, which was sort of a community grassroots movement. Thousands of organizations across the country organized in high schools and libraries, on university campuses, to explore the relationship between Americans, humans, and the natural world. And I think this is such a great opportunity to sort of honor that because we will be talking about Rochester, the change in Rochester as a city itself, but also what is, I would argue, one of the greatest environmental transformations of the North American landscape that has largely not been historicized until this book. So, yes, right. When I first moved here in 2014, I kept encountering this title, Flower City. Flower City. I didn't really know much about Flower City or why it was called Flower City. And when you move through the city, you start to see this label on all sorts of things. Some things that didn't seem to make much sense to be called Flower City, like Flower City Glass. Okay, I guess. I don't know. That's fine. Flower City Collision. Okay. How about some shoes? Flower City Kicks. Okay. And of course, Flower City Yoga. Very nice. All right? Other things that seemed a little antithetical to the notion or the imagery of Flower City as well. And there were some others that at least seemed in the ballpark of sort of a horticultural gardening vision. Flower City mulch, sure. We'll call Flower City Dispensary horticultural adjacent as well. So I wanted to understand the history of this, and I was interested in environmental history, which is a field that is interested in the historic relationship between humans and the natural world, recognizing that that relationship, of course, has changed. The views and values related to nature have changed, but also the material way that humans have shaped nature is an act of change as well. And to me, this seemed like a great way. Like, why is this image, why is Flower City being associated with this beautiful but post-industrial city, right, in 2014, Western New York? So I wanted to get to the bottom of this. So I'm going to sort of walk you through a little bit of this process, this history of where does Flower City get its name. And so I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about this, and of course there'll be questions at the end, and I'm happy to talk about this. Now, the origins of this story actually requires to go much, much, much further back, actually to the beginning of Rochester, New York in general, when it was called Flower City, but spelled a little bit differently, F-L-O-U-R. And it was a name that had been given to this city, given its focus on one economic engine that drove the economy of this young city. It was a city itself born of market fever and economically depressed in the years after the Panic of 1837, because up until the Panic of 1837, the rapid growth of the city offered little time for reflection or economic planning, and Rochester's population as well was ballooning at a meteoric rate. Rochester's population in 1825 was just over 4,000 residents, the same year that the Erie Canal is completed and moves through the city. By 1830, 5 years later, the city's population had doubled. By 1838, Rochester had grown to 20,000 residents. In a dizzying display of an American boom economy, Rochester grew from a settlement into a village into a town into a city. It really was considered at this time period the first American boom town. And this comes with a great deal of anxiety for people who are watching this take place. Rochester, as a result of this rapid growth, was not known for its scenic beauty. Various travelers, as they are moving through this young market city, will have some observations. Nathaniel Hawthorne, to whom the city appeared to have sprung up like mushrooms. When Frances Trollope, a British social critic who was known for searing observations, passed through, she described it as a product of the, quote, Jack and Beanstalk principle, and a city where, quote, the stumps of the forest were still to be found firmly rooted in the cellars. Another passerby in the 1830s claimed that, quote, everywhere the half-burnt stumps of trees, not the plain or the drear forest itself, spreads over the whole surface of the soil. Others described the city as, quote, a dirty place with no great beauty. It was a city filled with mud and rubbish, containing only a few houses which can be called handsome. At the dawn of the 1840s, no honest observer saw Rochester as a beacon of horticultural excellence. And this is because the city's urban economy and the surrounding rural economy were inextricably linked during the early development of Western New York. As such, the surrounding countryside became instrumental in the development of the flower industry, F-L-O-U-R. I guess I have to be specific here when we talk about that. In the years between 1825 and 1837, because the chief commodity in the city was wheat. One observer noted that by 1835, there were 21 different mills that operated 95 runs of stone. This meant in Rochester, in a single day, these mills were capable of producing 5,000 barrels of flour every single day. This was Flower City, F-L-O-U-R. The Interwoven dependence on this chief crop provided hefty returns for both farmers and merchants. However, the lack of economic diversity meant that the system was fragile and completely dependent on speculative pricing and optimistic markets on the more populous eastern seaboard. Much of the flour is being shipped to cities like New York and Philly that are growing much more rapidly, that are consuming all of this flour that's being produced in Rochester as well. But when the Panic of 1837 hit in Rochester, the chief economic forces completely collapsed. Prices for wheat and flour plummeted. From 1838 until 1944, 60% of the city's residents left Rochester. These numbers are staggering, right? 60% is a lot. But they're even more staggering when one considers that over the same period of time, Rochester maintained a population of 20,000 residents. Rochester's population after 1837 then was continuously shifting as transient populations of immigrants, New Englanders, and wealthy residents came and went in this struggling market city. As is the case in all financial recessions, depressions, or as the 19th century Americans like to call them, panics, many Americans began seeking out answers to the woes of the day. Many would critique this economic system. Some would blame the morals of Americans who had let themselves get greedy and overdependent on a chief economic system. Both spoke to the crisis of modernity. What came out of the Panic of 1837, though, was a reform movement. In Rochester, one of the more prominent forms of reform in this era would be based around horticulture. And that horticultural movement would be based out of a small company situated at the southern edge of the city. The Mount Hope Nursery, or as this slide says, the Mount Hope Botanical and Pomological Garden, the Mount Hope Nursery as I'll refer to it, was founded in 1840 between two partners, George Ellwanger and Patrick Berry. Both Ellwanger and Berry advocated that residents and agriculturalists should adopt horticultural pursuits to overcome the economic and social ills of the post-1837 years. Now, I know what you're thinking. In the midst of complete economic collapse, absolute financial ruin, mortgages are failing, banks are closing, and unemployment is rising, these two nurserymen thought that horticulture was the answer to the moment. Yes, right? Now, this requires us to historicize horticulture. It requires us to think about what horticulture might have meant to 19th century Americans. Perhaps today, we only consider it associated with sort of gardening, loosely based, right? Perhaps some consider horticulture as synonymous to gardening, even as a hobby whose practitioners spend their hours pruning ornamental plants, tending to flowers, or pulling weeds in order to maintain beautifully manicured grounds. More informed individuals would have a deeper understanding of the field's influence in the development of entirely new varieties of plant material. Regardless of what Americans think of horticulture today, their 19th century counterparts rightfully understood horticulture as an important and valuable science. By studying plant varieties, both native and imported, horticulturalists meticulously identified and isolated distinguishing traits of ornamental fruit trees, flowers, grasses, and shrubs. Through techniques like cross-fertilization and grafting, horticulturalists propagated entirely new species and varieties of plants. Now, they did this for a variety of reasons. Some hoped to create new and beautiful varieties for America's divergent climates. Others aimed to produce hardy and dependable fruit crops that would withstand frosts and bugs and blight. And still others tried to cultivate profitable varieties to be sold on the market as commodities to other gardeners and horticulturalists. But unlike modern biotechnologists, 19th century horticulturalists did not use syringes, they did not use test tubes. The garden and the greenhouse were their labs. They preferred leather gloves to white gloves if they chose to wear any at all. They sweat in the sun, they took water breaks, and regularly worked with pruning scissors, hoes, and shovels with their dirt-stained hands. Horticulture was physically demanding and intellectually taxing. And despite their influence in shaping the biological material, 19th century horticulturalists would shudder to think of themselves simply as scientists. Artists would probably be the more accurate term. Many horticulturalists believed themselves to be partaking in the fine arts when they labored in their gardens, fields, and orchards. By selecting or hybridizing the most beautiful varieties of plants, they showcased their intellect as well as their taste. Their science demonstrated the beauty of nature and the beauty of the mind. No antebellum thinker probably epitomizes this philosophy more than this individual here, Andrew Jackson Downing. So I'm going to leave Rochester briefly. We're going to go east to Newburgh, New York, which is just north of New York City up the Hudson River Valley. It was Downing, who is the editor of the horticultural journal of the day, The Horticulturalist. He's also the author of a fairly famous book called The Treatise on Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening. 19th century book titles. They're a whole page long in and of themselves, so we'll leave it at that. Largely credited for being the founder of landscape architecture as a field of study. He described horticulture as a, quote, beautiful and favorable art. But unlike paint and canvas or chisel and stone, horticulturalists use wheelbarrows, hoes, shovels, and pruners to turn what he called a tame meadow and a bleak aspect of earth into what he called an Eden of interest and delights. In his eyes, successful horticulturalists studied their natural surroundings and planted or created ideal and beautiful varieties of plants in order to create art out of the American landscape. And like all great arts, he believed horticulture had the power to move people. Antebellum horticulturalists believed that their work both demonstrated their own level of culture and had the ability to impart culture onto its onlookers. Improving the appearance of a rundown, ragged, or wild space contributed to the aesthetics of a neighborhood, of the city, of the country. Additionally, horticulturists believed that those affected onlookers who were witness to these natural creations, these natural masterpieces, would be moved, could be moved in different ways. Simply put, horticulturalists believed they had the power to enhance the nation. And if horticulture is the power to move people, if horticulture has this weight, then it was the plant nurseries, those companies that grew and sold nature's creations to consumers, that were the mechanism by which horticulture would take hold. Of course, Americans were quite familiar with plant nurseries in the 19th century, probably more so than we are today. Plant nurseries were essential components of 19th century life. They were often central to countless cities, towns, villages. The proprietors of these establishments were often known by name and served as a trusted source of information for plant material for those local communities. Throughout the 19th century, American settlers starting new homesteads relied on nurserymen for information about seeds and saplings, things that could grow in these new places that they were encountering. Middling and upper-class urbanites sought out these professional growers as well for idyllic varieties of plants to be put in their gardens and around their grounds. And social reformers, or landscape architects, turned to plant nurseries as they planned and planted rural cemeteries and public parks. As businesses with broad appeal, their proprietors were often tasked with lofty expectations. And I put this image up here. What is considered the first commercial nursery in America was not in Rochester, sorry, it's in Flushing, New York. And really what this business grows out of is this older practice of colonial plant trading that takes place in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is essentially these forms of boutique gardeners, of gentlemen who have these networks across the Atlantic Ocean. They're collecting sort of native species, and they're sending them back to sort of the colonial metropoles to sort of study this new continent, right? The individuals who are engaged in that trade will start to see that there's actually a market for plant material as populations are starting to decrease, as people are moving into new places. This first nursery was founded in 1723 by Robert Prince. And this is, again, just a small practice, a few of maybe 1 or 2 acres, again, just collecting a few specimens. But by the 1740s, the nursery was 24 acres in size. It was a fully fledged plant firm. First known advertisement from this firm is 1767. And what I love about the technology of the nursery catalog, and this is an early catalog of that Prince Flushing nursery, is that it doesn't change much in hundreds of years. Right? Only in the digital age has this started to look differently. Catalogs still look like this through the 20th century, which is essentially a long listing of what that firm has and how much you can pay for it. You will write back to them and say, I would like this, and I would like this, and I would like this. As the plant nursery business, as this industry grows up, right, becomes an industry, moves from this sort of cottage plant collecting into a full-fledged industry, it begins to take on social weight for consumers and owners. From the pages of the Horticulturalist, Downing, again, the editor of that journal, conferred onto nurserymen evangelical-like duties in the name of horticulture. Buried under his theories of landscape architecture, Downing advanced a set of expectations for the proprietors in this new industry, who he believed had the power to, quote, popularize the taste for rural beauty. He encouraged nurserymen to leave the grounds, talk to the residents of their communities, carry samples of honeysuckle, roses, peonies, or any other beautiful specimens that the nurserymen grew. Because Downing's goal was simple, right? Quote, to encourage men to plant at any and all rates. That was the nurseryman's job. Downing insisted that good nurserymen enmeshed themselves into their local community, reached out to their neighbors, advised them on how to shape their land and beautify the earth. And once taken root, Americans' desire for planting would continue to spread. A smart nurseryman would be wise to cultivate this desire for planting, as it would be a benefit to the American landscape, but of course to his business as well. So let's go back to the Mount Hope Nursery. It was in the midst of this financial panic that plant nurserymen burst onto the scene in Rochester, promoting a new economic and environmental ethic that they believe could assuage the troubles facing this market city, as well as the nearby countryside, also afflicted by this economic downturn. They embraced Downing's vision and offered their own solutions to the grim realities in Rochester, New York. Now, doing this work, spent a lot of time in 19th century agricultural journals. They can be good reading, or they can be great reading for bedtime. That's your call. But the big one out of Rochester, New York is the Genesee Farmer. It's published here. I love these images. They have these great sort of headers on them too, the sort of giving this illustration of bounty, of produce overflowing, agricultural goods overflowing. From the pages of the Horticulturalist, from the pages of the Genesee Farmer, this agricultural journal, Patrick Barry, one of the proprietors of that Mount Hope Nursery, begins also arguing with the sort of local community of why they should begin embracing the study of horticulture. In many cases, he's echoing Downing's argument. He believes that horticulture has the power to beautify the landscape, and of course will elevate the character of those who see these masterpieces, who partake in these masterpieces. As he saw it, the study of horticulture helped to, quote, contribute something towards the improvement of soil and its products, as well as the culture of the mind. By encouraging horticultural practice, Barry fused this language of post-panic reform to a new study of horticulture, to the practice of gardening. Now, he had a lot of different arguments for why this was the case, right? What is horticulture going to do? This has a practical reality. First and foremost, he's addressing these symptoms of Rochester, New York, this movement of people, right? This constant flow of people. To him, he says, what could be more satisfying? What could require someone to put roots down in the city than to plant and tend a garden themselves, right? You have to stay. You have to see that project through. You can't just move through. for the appearance of Rochester, which, as we've said, does not have a great reputation at this time period, this would literally just beautify the area. It could improve the real estate market as well, right? Create this larger perception to outside Americans that Rochester is not just a town you stop in on the way to the west or back to the east. It's a place to settle. And it had economic arguments as well, which is to say he would turn to agriculturalists who had overwhelmingly, even by the 1830s, had committed themselves to monocrop agriculture, almost entirely planting wheat, because it had been very profitable. But for him, turning a few acres over to fruit products, horticulture, right, could create economic diversity for the farmer and create pretty healthy profits. Apples go for a good price during this time period. It's not common to find delicious fruits in Rochester markets during the 1830s and 1840s. This is not a well-rounded diet in the region. And I love these excerpts. I just put out a few here just to say, like, getting at sort of this Barry's vision of horticultural reformation, you also have to go through just a lot of sort of mundane articles, right? And Barry has a vision, and it doesn't come through in every editorial. He's not sort of burning down the city constantly, right? Most of his articles are as mundane as the ones I have clipped here. The fruit garden, how to plant your fruit garden. Summer management of trees. What should you do in the summer to take care of these trees, right? The new year, what should you be thinking about? As winter is slowly starting to end, how do you prepare for the garden, right? So there's almost this sort of just how-to aspect to most of his editorials in which you get a taste, right? And again, he would have seen this as part of his professional responsibility. This is what was required of nurserymen, to teach people how to be horticulturalists. As such, the nurserymen believed it was also their businesses, not necessarily just their publications, that would be the primary vehicle for horticultural reformation. They never saw a distinction between their business activity and their ideals, simply understanding that natural beauty and profit were two sides of the same coin. And so what I will say, and which is going to turn this a little bit, is that we must understand Rochester nurserymen within the larger context of their 19th century moment. Because what I also argue is that the plant trade and the rise of plant nurseries are inextricably linked to the territorial expansion of the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, right? We can point to things like the Northwest Land Ordinance, the Louisiana Purchase, the subsequent Indian Wars, the Mexican-American War, just to name a few examples, right? Through a combination of war, economic displacement, and predatory diplomacy, Americans fervently fought, argued, and signed away real estate from Native Americans. So when Rochester area nurserymen began to eye what we now call the Midwest or the West for its market potential in the 1840s, those places still held the due of 18th and 19th century expansionist policies. By introducing horticultural material to the American landscape, nurserymen enabled Euro-American settlers to colonize remote environments by replicating familiar environments in those places. Moving plants on roads, on rivers, on canals, in rails. Nurserymen offered plant material to Euro-American settlers striving to transform the America they encountered, what they would have called wilderness, into the culturally familiar and economically essential farm, orchard, a garden. A business empire for the nurserymen of Rochester, New York, was literally the business of empire. No firm embodied this dramatic transformation, this new market move like the Mount Hope Nursery. By 1860, the firm maintained nearly 500 acres of nursery grounds, making it the largest plant nursery in the world. The proprietors also made multiple business decisions to expand westward. They established sister companies and partnered with Western nurserymen to ensure access to burgeoning Western markets. For example, in 1845, they formed a partnership with a young Canadian horticulturalist, George Leslie, and provided initial capital and nursery stock necessary to establish the Toronto Nursery Company. In 1854, they repeated this move again in Ohio, helping to establish the Columbus Nursery after sending an employee to move there and manage this new Ohio-based operation. They knew settlers moving west, and they worked hard to ensure that it was their plant material that would be the basis for new homesteads in towns across the continent. The firm also employed plant agents, nearly 70 of them at the company's peak in the 1870s, to travel the countryside, walking through these sort of western places, carrying with them images of flowers or apples or anything that they had back at the grounds to show them and say, we can offer you this, this will grow here, this will offer you this, right? That was a traveling salesman to cultivate these sales, to move from town to town to find these buyers. This is an image that was published in it's actually a great little magazine. It's the Hunting's Merchant Magazine, which basically just tracks like these companies in the mid-19th century and telling you how they work and why they're sort of essential businesses. They had a whole expose on the Mount Hope Nursery, which they saw as this sort of unique business, this entrepreneurial expertise, this sort of anomaly. And they have this image of this packing shed that is at the center of their grounds. So as orders come in, they are given to people who are working in the nursery rows. They run out, grab the specimens, bring them back to the packing shed where they're put into boxes and shipped out to their final destinations. So trying to track the sort of material aspects of this trade was really hard because nurserymen's voices are not well documented in the historical record. For the most part, nurserymen move from town to town. They're often immigrants. They often don't speak English or know how to write. The actual textual records of these businessmen is hard to get at. But I was fortunate and completely lucky to land in Rochester and spend way too much time, no, it's a great amount of time, in the special collections at the University of Rochester, because what they had was a godsend to what I needed, which was ledgers. 19th century business ledgers. Not a lot in terms of letters, not a lot in terms of correspondence in their early years, but what I have is the business record of this company, truly from its beginning in the 1840s to its end in the 1910s and 1920s. And I spent way too much, the right amount of time with this. I'm going to show you what these look like. I had to learn double entry accounting as well, and I got into history to get away from numbers, and this is an issue. But anyway, so once I figured out how to actually decipher these things, there's actually an incredible amount of information in this, right? Because if you can see here, I know it's a little vague, but you essentially have a sale that is marked with the person's name at the center. Top, we have the location for where they are located and the amount of the sale. So I don't always know what plants are being shipped. I can tell you it's mostly fruit trees and some other specimens, but for the most part it's going to be fruit trees. But by documenting this, collecting this sales information, I begin to see an economic footprint of this one company and thus an ecological footprint of this one company. So every 10 years, I went into the ledgers and documented every sale. I wanted to see how this company was growing from 1845 to 1915. And I'm just going to show you a few here. So by taking those sales and creating sort of a marker here, oh, that's a little vague here, I'm sorry about that. But what we can see here, can you see any of the lines there? Okay. Rochester's clearly making the most sales here, right? This is a local business for the most part, but by 1845, we're clearly seeing that footprint, a partnership that they had set up in Toronto, which is creating a sizable sale for this company as well. If you also notice sort of just the geographic displacement of where sales are happening, this is largely following the route of the Erie Canal, right? These communities, the plants are moving on this canal, which is easing the travel of this plant material, right? So this is still a local New York State company in 1845, but if we check in 10 years later, this company has grown quite a bit, right? Rochester is still a major sales base for them, and I'll explain why that is in a second here. But clearly they are starting to move further into the Great Lakes region, into sort of the upper Midwest region where plant sales are developing. Again, these are where settlers, Euro-American settlers, are moving into, trying to create new farmsteads, trying to create their own sort of new communities as well. 1885, we continue to see that spread happening. And this is just sort of condensing it for you. They're selling all the way in every state by the end of the 19th century, as well as global sales as well. But this is not a model that's limited to the Mount Hope Nursery. By the middle decades of the 19th century, Rochester was home to dozens of nurserymen whose businesses supplied buyers with plant material. Rochester Nursery, which was owned by Samuel Molson, which is the future land that would later become the public market, was operating at that time. I'm going to just go through a few of these, and I'll just say also a complicated part of this process is keeping track of all the nurseries. They change names all the time. There's new investors coming in, but yeah, it's fun. By 1845, the similarly named Rochester Commercial Nursery, located a mile east of the city, was operated by Josiah Bissell and Horace Hooker. Across the river from the Mount Hope Nursery, Alonzo Frost managed the rapidly growing Genesee Valley Nursery. Frost's operation overshadowed the smaller, though similarly named Genesee Falls Nursery, situated on the city's northern edge. Agriculturalists and urban residents looking for seeds, shrubs, or trees might visit those or other firms, such as the Flora Garden Nursery, the Rochester Seed Store, the John Rappelgee and Company Nursery, the Rochester and Charlotte Plank Road Nurseries, the Riverbank Nursery, the Old Rochester Nurseries, the Carthage Nurseries, or the Parrington Nursery. In fact, by 1855, New York State Census noted that 150 nurserymen lived in the vicinity of Rochester, New York. This is an astounding number when you also look at that same census that recorded a total of 300 nurserymen in the entire state of New York. 30 years later, that number increases, where 4,000 individuals worked at a plant nursery within Rochester. Oh, sorry, I was going to show this. And these are just a few examples. Again, this trade is happening with those traveling salesmen, but largely through plant catalogs, right? In which you would advertise in agricultural journals. People would mail in saying, I'm looking for these plants. I need to find nurseries who can supply me with these things. Nurserymen are sending out these catalogs in which you would essentially find a local dealer that you could sort of coordinate the financial aspects of this, or simply mail money back to the nursery. They would go out, they would put it in a box and send it to you. Right? This is the plant trade still today, though it has become a little more modernized in the digital era. One of my favorite images is from, this would have been the banner at the top of one of the catalogs, a short-lived company that was run by George Fish. This is part of a catalog that he also tried to posit as a sort of journal called the Eclectic Ruralist and Nursery Exchange Journal. But at the top, what do we see here? We have a train moving from the right to the left, implied to the reader east to west. What is on these train cars? Fruit and ornamental trees, evergreens and tree seeds, grapes and roses, and yes, tools and labels. I love that image. This is like the one-off image in the American Antiquarian Society, and I thought it was just a beautiful encapsulation of what's going on here. The business venture, this plant trade, as part of Western expansion, is incredibly profitable. And it's shaping environments across the country. But it also has impact back in Rochester, New York. As we noted, the plant nursery industry is beginning to reshape the economic landscape in the city. It's beginning to shape social life. Back at the Mount Hope Nursery, the biggest of all of these, right? The business owners were soon flush with cash from this new plant trade. They became founding directors of the new Flower City Bank, FLOUR, in 1856, where Barry served as the president for several years. Years later, Barry would serve as the president for the Rochester City and Mechanics Savings Bank, solidifying his role as a prominent member of this community. In 1862, those two nurserymen, Barry and Ellwanger, expanded beyond real estate and invested their earnings into a horse line company, replacing the smaller omnibus line that had struggled to remain financially solvent during the economic hardships of the Panic of 1857. They later transformed that into the Rochester City and Brighton Railroad Company, which was essentially the trolley system that operated in Rochester, conveniently with a stop that took them to Mount Hope Cemetery, right across the street from the Mount Hope Nursery. You know, visit a loved one, bring them some flowers, right? In 1888, they completed the construction of the newest addition to the city's skyline, the Ellwanger and Berry building, which is still downtown, right? Sort of lost in sort of the 20th century skyscrapers that define Rochester's skyline today. But when this building was built, this was a pinnacle of architectural excellence. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I do think it was the first completely fireproof building built in Rochester during this time period. And it's still quite a beautiful building, sort of that marks this Gilded Age as well. But this is not just limited to these two individuals. Okay, one more slide. Daniel Moore, who's the owner and editor of another prominent journal published in Rochester, New York, called the Rural New Yorker, served a term as mayor from 1865 and 1866. Charles Briggs of the Briggs, Bros. And Seed Company also held that office in the 1870s, often noting in his advertisements, in his catalogs, that they were essential parts of the social fabric, the political and civic life of Rochester, New York as well. But perhaps the most significant remnant of the nurseryman's influence in the city is the park system. From the pages of the Genesee Farmer, Patrick Berry had been advocating for a park system as early as 1847. But it wasn't until the 1880s, when they had established social prestige, developed rich profits, right, from this business of empire, that the horticulturalists could make this dream a reality. This is an editorial from 1847 in which he is writing, saying that public grounds, public parks, should be established and sustained by every state in the Union. They would be great sources of profitable instruction, teaching people the art of horticulture, the beauty and appreciation of nature, as well as a delightful recreation and amusement. But again, it wouldn't be till the 1880s when this dream becomes a reality. Because in 1884, these nurserymen, as well as several throughout the city, begin to press the city government to designate a portion of land to serve as the basis of the city's park system. Ellwanger and Berry even offered a small 20-acre plot to serve as the beginnings of these park systems. After 3 years of relative silence, the city council finally approved the proposal in 1887. Ellwanger and Berry turned over the land that would serve as the foundation for the municipal park system in Rochester. And the terms of the arrangement also ensured that the city officials would seek out additional land. The small 20-acre portion that will become the basis of Highland Park, right, was too small for one of these grand park systems, and so the city agreed to adopt more land. In 1888, they also created the Board of Park Commissioners, naming a handful of men to serve in that role, including Patrick Berry's son, William, to overlook the city's park system. And in 1888, they also hired famed designer Frederick Law Olmsted to begin designing this park system. Now, I want to focus here as we're getting close to sort of wrapping up this piece here. Let's see if I can move it. Oh, sorry. Highland Park. Focusing on Highland Park explicitly here. Yeah, we can. We can try. Yeah, you might lose me, but that's all right. You've seen enough of me, all right? There you go. That's a little bit better. It is a faint image to begin with. Can we all imagine? Have we been to Highland Park maybe yet? I'll wait for the announcement to pass. All right. Now, Highland Park is unique, right? This is the parcel of land that Ellwanger and Berry first donate to the city. And as it's designed, if you go there, it is unique from most of Olmsted's designs. It's an arboretum with sections dedicated to many varietals and species of plants. It's also much smaller than what Olmsted liked to work with. He wanted bigger plots of land. He wanted to create pastoral settings that sort of were reminiscent of a British countryside in these American park systems. Highland Park is not that. It is full of different sections of plants that actually are numbering hundreds, thousands of varietals of that plant, right? It is an arboretum. It is very, very different. And what it meant to be was that it was supposed to be a sort of honorary representation of the influence of that nursery in making the city itself. And I'm going to pull, can I pull the lights back up? Okay. In letters between William Barry, Patrick's son, again, he's in charge of the City Park Commission, and Olmsted, we even see Olmsted connecting this new park, Highland Park, to the potential business interests of the nurseries, right? Distinctions between public park and commercial exhibit further blurred, as Olmsted outlines how Highland Park could be an aid to the larger horticultural industry in Rochester, New York. These are from his letters that he's sending to William Barry, right? It cannot be questioned that a good collection of well-grown plants, clearly labeled and examined with the advantage of skillfully annotated catalogs, would be of very great value to the entire nursery interests of Rochester, essentially proposing that as people are visiting this public park, this beautiful space, what if the nurserymen just happen to have catalogs available? They see the plant, they like the plant, they got to buy the plant. Of course, as it is continuing with this larger horticultural argument, right, Olmsted, of course, sees this as coinciding with the larger vision of this horticultural movement that really does maintain throughout the 19th century, right? This can help to advance the popular practice of planting art throughout the country. Rochester was reinvented. A city in the midst of economic collapse created social and economic openings where new capitalists could envision a different way. Deeply romantic in their views of nature, emboldened by the responsibilities of their profession, and enmeshed in the larger political developments of the 19th century, the plant nurserymen of Rochester, New York, enabled and promoted American empire. This was not an empire, though, defined by guns and treaties. No, it was an empire of flowers, of fruit trees, and creeping vines. When the Chamber of Commerce began promoting Rochester as the Flower City, Flower, by the early 20th century, it was identifying a longer history of environmental transformation, both within the city and abroad. These are the roots of Flower City. Thank you.
At this time, we're going to do some Q&A. Kim will bring you the microphone, and that way our people watching on the live stream will be able to hear all of your questions. So if you have a question for Dr. Burd, please just raise your hand.
The first question is always the hardest.
Okay, I don't want it to be hard. So with these changes that were going on,
Yeah.
right, and this economic development that was going on, did you see anything that gave you any general idea of how this industry impacted immigration into the community?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I was just at across the street looking in sort of the archives, and I was saying the hardest part of this story was trying to find sort of the histories of the workers themselves, right, instead of the proprietors. But overwhelmingly, right, this is going to be immigrant workforce, particularly at the Mount Hope Nursery. It'll be a lot of German immigrants who are working there. It is immigrants who had a longer experience in sort of viticulture and horticulture, and that labor this is skilled labor, right? And so it does require a particular knowledge of how do you graft, how do you care for these plants. Grafting trees is very tedious and is very difficult and does not always take, right? So you do need expert skills to do that. So
And also immigrants from similar climates.
Right. Familiarity with the plant material, absolutely, yeah. And Ellwanger himself is a German immigrant. He moves around, he lives in Ohio for a little while, settles back into Rochester, New York, takes over a firm in this economic moment. So he himself, and Patrick Barry is an English immigrant. I mean, this is an often, Irish, sorry, yes. Sorry, that is critical, I'm out. Irish. Woo.
Over to the other side.
Oh, hold on, we had a question. Yeah, sorry, yeah. Just to get the
Hi.
microphone. Yeah, hi.
I talk about the history of the public market a lot.
Yeah.
I am president of Friends of the Public Market. My name's Leslie. And within the context of the public market,
Yeah.
it's really nice to have this depth because I'm actually giving a tour on Thursday, so I'm going to
great.
add that. And one of the things I'm missing from the history of the market and Rochester as a whole is brown people like me, because we were here, we were doing things, but nobody can ever tell us what was going on.
Yeah.
And I understand that it's not necessarily talked about, but why isn't it talked about? Was there information you could find? I know you said it was hard to find information on the workers, but
Yeah.
who wasn't talked about who may have been there? And who wasn't
Yeah.
allowed to be there? Because
Yeah.
that also is worth mentioning.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great question. I mean, that piece is the hardest piece, is who is working in these nursery grounds. And again, what I will say is I think this still remained as an industry, especially towards the later half of the 19th century, that this would have been a little bit more industrialized. This would have been more of sort of a working population that would move around a little bit as well. And again, it's just hard to capture some of those stories as well. Yeah, I don't have an answer for your question, but yeah, I mean, labor, that would be like, that's the big thing. Who's doing the work of this throughout this time period is the question I'm still trying to find. The ledgers do not name the workers. Right, which is unfortunate. But we do know that, like I think the Mount Hope Nursery employed 250 people during the busy seasons, right? You can expect that. I mean, that's the largest plant nursery, but other nurseries certainly would have had labor forces that were in the dozens, hundreds as well.
I just due to my knowledge of history, I expect exclusion of people like me. And even mentioning
In those, in gardening spaces?
in public,
Yeah, yeah,
in jobs that pay well, that require knowledge.
yeah,
I tend to come from an expectation
Yeah.
of exclusion
yeah,
versus inclusion. And even mentioning that,
yeah.
there's no information. I understand.
These were not always well-paid jobs. I mean, this was work for immigrants and lower-paid employees. Though it was skilled labor, it was not well-paid labor.
But this was also during the time of the nurseryman was also during the time of slavery and
Yeah.
past
Yeah.
emancipation.
Yeah.
So that was
Yeah.
people who were working and had the skills to do the job,
Mhm.
but were they mentioned, were they included, or was there, like there tends to be a whole nother place where perhaps this was occurring that was not necessarily as publicly accessible due to exclusionary policy. So I just,
Yeah,
as you talk about it, even mentioning what you don't know,
Mhm.
adds depth to how much work you've done.
absolutely.
All right. So two questions, actually, one both inspired by the previous.
Sure.
And they're unfortunately not closely related. So the first question was thinking about the time period that you're focusing on and how horticulturalists begin to sort of seize the moment and envision this sort of new Rochester, that during the 19th century, this is the exact same time where we are the sort of birthplace of the civil rights movement, and Frederick Douglass and other members of the community are beginning to agitate for abolition on a national stage. And I wonder that if the horticulturists are sort of envisioning and seeing themselves in some way as social reformers, have you uncovered any sort of interaction between those sort of two coexistent reform
Yeah.
movements in Rochester at
Yeah.
the same time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yes, would be the answer. And what I would say is, like, these reformers, reform and activism bleed a lot, right? People don't necessarily stay in one lane. And so what I will say is a lot of the social reformers, and again, I write about this a little bit more in the book, and I obviously couldn't put it all in the presentation, but a lot of the reformers who are involved in abolition and women's rights movement are also involved with activities in the horticultural societies that are starting to develop. So they see this movements, right? These are people living full lives and sort of enmeshed in what Rochester is, this center of activism and reform, particularly in the antebellum period. And what I propose for the nurseries is that they are very much also embedded in this, right? Like, they are proposing horticulture not only as an economic thing. To them, this is a deeply moral project, right? The ability to work land on your own, right? To them seems sort of like this pinnacle of sort of American liberalism, right? There's nothing worse that could be stuck working in a factory, right? One should be an agrarian, one should be almost Jeffersonian in that vision as well, right? It's not always a well thought through ideology, mostly because they're also just running plant businesses, right? They're not thinking through these things all the way, which also tells us that their biases are there as well. But they are very much enmeshed in the Rochester sort of political and social fabric that is sort of coursing through the city at this time period.
Okay. And then my other question was thinking about the sort of like leading into the late 19th century and into the 20th century. You talk about, with the large focus with Ellwanger and Berry and these other nurseries with often fruiting trees. Mm-hmm. Is there a connection thinking about produce at the public market and our sort of very large and sizable apple production that still lasts to this day, especially in Wayne County, but then rolling back a little further of like melons and peaches in the town of Irondequoit and the vineyards lining the slopes down to Irondequoit Bay. Is there a connection there as well, that it's not just this sort of social reform and focusing on park making, but is there also this sort of expansion into production of sort of fruit farming at scale in the Rochester region as a sort of next step in this sort of vision of the horticulturalist here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, I was just pulling up those maps. I'll tell you, in 1855, this is not for public parks, right? This is for horticultural transformation, right? They're so connected to this larger horticultural scene, not just sort of boutique horticulture, what becomes commercial horticulture, right? They are, what I would argue is like these nurserymen are why New York State is such an apple state, right? The sort of, and why I sort of posited this is one of the biggest environmental transformations that nobody's talking about, is because we don't consider that an apple orchard in Maine looks like the same as an apple orchard in Washington State, right? In many cases, the same plant is in both places. And that history is sort of the sort of mundane grandiosity of what is a business empire during this time period. I didn't talk through this. So an average plant, like if you're talking just sort of a regular sapling, is about 6 cents. Right? This would have just been sort of a regular plant that you just put on the corner lot, you use for cider. This is not sort of a fancy one. Maybe $1 if you're going for a sort of a really unique hybrid, something that's quite fancy, desirable, right? But if you look at some of these sales numbers, right? In 1855, the peak is something like 5,000 in sales. And if you do the math, I mean, these, over the course of their time, they're sending out millions of plants from this one nursery, right? Now multiply this by all the other nurseries that are not as big, so they're not doing as big of a scale, but they're all in this exact same business model, which is shipping plants to transform North America. I didn't get for it for the sake of time here, but one of the biggest conflicts facing apple growers, the sort of commercial side of things, not just sort of the boutique parks, is this little bug called the San Jose scale, which shows up in California in 1870s. By 1890s, it has made its way to the East Coast. And the primary target for why this bug is spreading is blamed on plant nurserymen. And it is the orchardists that are going to start advocating that this plant trade be diminished or highly regulated. You start to see inspection laws get placed in across states, right? And what begins to contract in the 1890s is this larger plant trade. It becomes more local. It becomes more localized. And you start to see agricultural colleges or Cornell's botanical stations becoming regulators of the plant trade. And nurserymen are not happy about this, right? They like the laissez-faire, free trade, big business mode, right? So they're fighting this stuff a little bit as well, which leads them into City Beautiful, because they can see that as another way to sort of get revenue streams. So it's a long-winded answer to hopefully answer your question. Thank you.
Is there any indication that grape growing and the wine industry developed here?
Yeah, I mean, this was really hard to sort of hone in on like what was moving, what was changing. I know George Ellwanger in particular was really interested in establishing viticulture in the region as well, and moving grapes around. There's a great book called, lose it now. Empire Vines, that is about sort of the the viticultural industry and essentially sort of how grapes become a tool of empire during the 19th century as well. Erica Hanikel, who wrote that book. It's a great book, and she does talk about Western New York a little bit as well as part of that story. So yeah.
Rochester wine, for instance?
Oh, no, I haven't, no. I mean, there might have been, but I didn't see it. The big apple, the apple that really sort of made Western New York the apple was the Northern Spy. Because it was a winter apple, it kept its flavor long, it grew well into the winter, and if you think about it just from an economic standpoint, what that meant is you had an apple that could go onto the winter market in cities later in the season, which made it much more profitable, right? So finding a hardy variety of apple that was still worth eating was an incredibly lucrative business, and that, Northern Spy was just sort of a random varietal that developed in Western New York. 19th century, a lot of cider because you did not trust the water when you drank it, so cider is actually a very common source of consumption during this time period, but also just, apples for market as well. Hello.
Hi. So you've talked a lot about how horticulture kind of shaped Rochester's growth. I'm curious if you've had time or capacity to think about how those old gardening and landscape ideas still show up in the way that we think about green spaces, neighborhoods, or even in public health today?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, well, it's tough working with these horticulturalists, I think, sort of figuring out how you feel about them. Because in one way, you read their writing and you sort of, you think about the sort of the earnestness in which they spoke of a true ethic towards land, a concern for gardening, right? This notion of having an appreciation for nature. They go off a lot on what they call catch-a-penny movements of the day, right? The circuses, the plays, the sort of brothels, things like that. They want the garden. They see this as like a deeply moral space, and there's some class elements to that too. But at the same time, like, we look at their business, right? I mean, like, these guys did profit off of like the 19th century sin of American empire, right? And so it's a complicated story, which makes it an incredibly human story, right? But I would say it is compelling to me that still the biggest aspects of their influence are still the places in Rochester that people seek out the most, right? These park systems, right? I mean, in just a few weeks, everyone will descend on Highland Park, for better or for worse, for Lilac Festival, right? But they will descend there because the flowers are beautiful, right? And fried food will abound. But these are spaces for the public, and I think there is something to the notion of sort of a public green space, a public garden space, that is worth advocating for.
You have such beautiful images in your presentation. Could you talk about how you selected the image for your book cover?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Erin. That's my wife. I didn't plant that, no. It's actually a great story. It was actually Cornell University Press, total credit to them. I had initially wanted to use the image that, of course, sorry, I got a high resolution image that's really slowing things down here. This image is the cover, which I thought was a beautiful image. The fun fact about the Mount Hope Cemetery is, as it's being founded in the 1840s, Mount Hope Nursery donates the first plants to start this, right? Which in the urban or the rural cemetery movement, these are the first parks, right? You don't have public parks yet. Cemeteries are the parks. Anyway, I like this because you can see their influence, and it's also got this sort of idyllic vibe to it. But they were like, no. What if we took one of these old catalogs, which are also quite gorgeous, right? And made something out of that, sort of took a catalog and make it the book cover. So, I mean, that's credit to the book designers at Cornell University Press. They killed it.
So I live in the part of the city that's called the Ellwanger-Berry neighborhood, and I've always been curious to know, I know you've said that we don't have a lot of ways of knowing the lives of the everyday worker, but I've been curious about that area. First, was it ever horticultural land where the houses are now in that neighborhood? And then when did it start moving over to a residential area, and were they workers from the nursery who were able to live in those houses? Because I know my house is 1872, and it's one of the older ones in the neighborhood, I think. So I don't think it was really transforming into a residential area until the late 19th century?
Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, great question. So there's different pieces to that. So as this company is starting to grow in the 1850s and 1860s, the Mount Hope Nursery is a little bit unique in this. And they have extremely paternalistic views of business practices, right? And so they actually build, and again in the book I have some images and I talk about this a little bit more, they build homes for the sort of upper tier managers who run this nursery. And so a lot of those older homes are sort of the old managers' homes. But they also, and I brought the San Jose scale image, is because what starts to happen in the 1890s is as states are putting in laws. I mean, it's a business industry that is unique in the sense that they are also always creating new competition, right? They are providing the plant material for the new nursery getting put in another town, right? So over time, right, they are creating more competition. Then you have this San Jose scale that is scaring people. And just the political economy of the plant trade was changing, so much so that for American politicians, empire is not the big project, right? Protecting growers' interests is a much more politically salient issue. And so as these new laws get put into place, you start to see these nurseries start to decline. And what do they become? They become real estate companies. They begin laying out suburbs, some of the most idyllic suburbs in Rochester, still what is the most valued land in the city of Rochester as well, right? Vicks is on the east side. That becomes, Park Ave, East Ave. Like, these are very desirable parts of the city. Much of the South Wedge is the old Mount Hope land that also becomes very desirable land as well. So the homes that come in are often built by these companies. Ellwanger and Berry Real Estate becomes a company in the early 20th century as well. A long-winded answer, if that. Sit on down.
So 2 questions, both of them more contextualizing your work in relationship to other writers on related topics. Now you finally mentioned Vic there just a moment ago, and I was a little surprised. I'm thinking back to Tom Mickey and All About Flowers, who spoke here after that book was published. Mm-hmm. So that points more at the business element here. I've spoken about these horticulturalists as being businessmen, but the innovative nature of how they had to work across the national economy, a truly national economy, an early point, was Mickey's whole focus. In terms of your own work, how would you contextualize that? How do you see some of these other nurserymen working across the idea of a national economy, in particular the difference they have working with live plant stock versus seed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do sort of separate out the nursery, which is, again, like saplings, which are much harder to ship, right? I mean, these things dry out, they die. Rats eat them all the time. There's all these stories of rats making their way into boxes and eating the roots of plants. Seeds are much easier, right? Seeds are dried out. They can become mechanic and almost in their nature of how they're packed. If you look at some of the big seed houses, they become machines. We do have more information on the labor with seed packing plants, which is to say that it is almost entirely children and women who are doing this work, as the bosses will say, because they have smaller hands. They also are getting paid much less as well, right? But the seed industry doesn't get hit as much with a lot of this legislation because it is going to be focused on live plants, not dried seeds. So a lot of those firms will continue, right? Harris is still a major seed plant. Crossman, which I need to mention, right? Crossman Seeds, which are available on the back, right? That's a company that was founded in 1838, right? And is still in production. It still can go to their warehouse and factory, right, on East Ave, right? So it was just in itself kind of an interesting little sort of museum if you get the chance to go check it out. And so there is this national economy. It shifts. The seed trade begins to shift as well. But the live plants become something of an issue for those engaged in that. So the bigger firms can do a little bit of both, but you do start to see a bifurcation between companies during this time period.
And the other question, I'm thinking back, my introduction to this particular part of American environmental history was a book called Larding the Lean Earth.
Yes.
That came out in the early 2000s. And that, as I recall, focused far more on the reforming element.
Yeah.
Now, you probably talked about that a bit already, but more on a human side.
Yeah.
As I recall, that book focused a lot more on the idea of agricultural reform as tool of empire building.
Yeah.
Did you see that more explicitly showing up in the work coming out of the Rochester Nurserymen?
Yeah, that's a great book. He talks a lot about poop in that book. Larding the Lean Earth, Larding the Lean Earth. And it focuses on agricultural reform, I think in New Jersey or Pennsylvania and South Carolina. And those places are different contextually because those places are, in fact, experiencing a lot more just sort of soil erosion, actual detriment to the soil base because of overplanting. So for them, reform had a deeply sort of biological component of it as well, about regenerating the soil. Whereas in Rochester, you do start to see wheat being overplanted to the point of exhaustion, but not to the same degree because this had been happening so quickly that this boom, essentially from the late 1820s into the 1830s, is not a long-standing trade. And so there is some argument about like this is going to be better for the soil to just plant some trees, and you can sort of maintain that a lot easier. But like the environmental basis for the argument is not quite the same. It's sort of an economic and deep and kind of a spiritual argument as well. I mean, some of the earliest speeches I have on Patrick Barry's sort of reform aspects is not as an editor of the horticultural section of the Genesee Farmer. It's he's at a church. He's at the Hibernian Temperance Society in the Catholic Church downtown, and he's sort of drawing pretty clear lines between things like temperance, which is a big movement during this time period as well, and horticultural reformation. Right? Again, like these things blur. Like these movements blur. It is not sort of clear definitions of what reform movements are the reform movements. People know things are bad and things need to be improved, and there's sort of like an engine to that movement as well.
We'll take one more question.
Is there anybody else? Anybody else?
These are great questions. This is incredible. I never get these many questions.
I'm really curious if you, in your research, encountered any stories that kind of make you think about the things that we are talking about, like in today's, like things around climate change, or even food insecurity.
Yeah.
Or I'm curious if you encountered anything like that.
That's a great question. I mean, great question. So let me take the first one. I mean, climate is an interesting thing to historicize, right? Because 19th century horticulturists and agriculturists did understand climate, but they didn't understand it necessarily in the biggest scope of things. They understood it based on local experiences, right? So what that means is they understand that when you clear cut a forest, right? If you clear these things out, it does make it hotter where it's at, right? The sun roasts you. It will dry out the soil, right? They have this concept that obviously climate can change with human action. And so for much of this, like, we're talking about massive transformation of the land, but there's not an anxiety that turning it over to, let's say, orchards is going to be an issue, right? These are trees, you know, they're trying to lay out sort of a bucolic horticultural vision, right? So there's that anxiety doesn't quite exist, or that concern. The other question about food, I think absolutely that's part of this story as well. I mean, especially in the early days as they're sort of observing the sort of dire situation in Rochester in particular in the 1830s and 1840s, right? Like, they simply are saying, like, there needs to just be more foodstuffs, right? And the economy needs to get better so that we can provide this, that it becomes available. You can't eat, I mean, you can bake flour, but you're not eating flour, you're not eating wheat in the same way. So, like, there is a concern about food during that process as well. And again, there's sometimes a disconnect. There is a class element to this, right? They are sort of, they become elites. They're not always elites. Like, they are immigrants who are engaged early on in what is seen as undesirable work. But they become sort of elites during that time period. And to them, right, this desire, this sort of, as they see it, this slippage of society towards an industrial one is one in which folks are getting further away from this sort of activity of food growing, of knowing nature, of access to these things. It's sort of underneath. I would not say, and I say this in the book, right, these are reformers, they are not radicals. And I think that's an important part of that story as well. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Be sure to grab a seed packet, and if you want to buy the book, you get a 30% discount by using this QR code, which is also on the seed packet. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burd, for providing such an engaging lecture and Q&A session. And thank you all for spending your time with us tonight.